Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on another COVID-19 Clinical Town Hall. Today is Thursday, April 16th. My name is Carrie Lynn Vox, and I am the Senior Manager of Chapter and State Relations for AORN. All attendees have been muted. Your feedback is very important to us. During the town hall, please submit questions or comments in the chat box below. If you are unable to get to your question before the end of the hour, we will post all questions and answers on our aorn.org/COVID-19 support page. Please review the outcomes for this webinar listed here. A link will also be provided after the meeting to view and download the webinar if you are not able to stay with us for the entire session. One contact hour will be given for this session, and evaluation instructions will be sent via email and posted on our COVID support page by tomorrow. I would now like to introduce Linda Groh, AORN CEO and Executive Director. Linda?
Thank you, Carrie Lynn. Good evening, and welcome to our fourth COVID-19 clinical update. With each passing week, we are learning new strategies and practices to keep ourselves safe and our patients cared for. With these town halls, we're able to share with you the most relevant and current information available. AORN is also looking ahead to determine how to best support the next phase of COVID-19. We know that will occur when facilities begin to return to doing surgical procedures, while they are trying to manage the backlog of elective surgeries. To that end, AORN collaborated with the American College of Surgeons, the American Society of Anesthesiologists, and the American Hospital Association to develop a roadmap for resuming elective surgery after the COVID-19 pandemic. This roadmap will be released tomorrow to the national news media, and you'll find it on the landing page of our website. It will guide physicians, nurses, and local facilities in their resumption of care for the operating and the procedural areas. For this evening, AORN's Town Hall, the subject matter experts will discuss a comprehensive protocol for care of a COVID-19 or a COVID-19 suspected patient in the OR. You'll have an up-to-date information about N95 decontamination, and the AORN nurses will answer many of the questions that you've asked via the nurse consult line and OR Nurse Link. Dr. Lisa Spruce, our Director of Evidence-Based Perioperative Practice, will be our moderator. Lisa?
Thank you, Linda. Welcome, everyone. Our panelists are Karen DeKay, Terry Link, and Aaron Kyle. Karen DeKay is certified in perioperative nursing and infection control and has more than 20 years experience developing education, including online modules and utilizing quality improvement processes to standardize patient care. Recently, she was the lead author for revision of the AORN guideline for environmental cleaning and serves as the AORN representative for the Healthcare Infection Control Practices Advisory Committee at CDC. Karen has authored several clinical issues columns in the AORN Journal and has provided presentations for the Denver APIC chapter on infection prevention in the perioperative environment. Terry Link is product manager of guideline implementation tools and an ambulatory education specialist at AORN. She is a certified operating room nurse, certified in infection control, and recently certified in ambulatory infection prevention. At AORN, she develops Guideline Essentials, an online suite of tools to implement AORN guidelines. Her background includes working in ambulatory surgery centers in numerous roles, including infection prevention. Dr. Aaron Kyle is Editor-in-Chief, Guidelines for Perioperative Practice at AORN. She is lead author for the Guideline for Sterilization and the Guideline for Sterilization Packaging Systems. Aaron collaborates with the nursing practice team to support AORN members with answers to clinical questions via the AORN consult line and through the clinical issues column in the AORN Journal. She is a member of and serves as the staff liaison to AMI and ASTM, where she is active in national and international standards development. We will get started with a discussion from Terry and Karen on the comprehensive protocol for care of a COVID-19 or COVID-19 suspected patient in the OR.
Thank you, Lisa. We have received many requests to develop a protocol to use in caring for patients who are COVID-19 positive or suspected of being positive in the operating room. This has been a challenging task with guidance from many professional organizations, including CDC, the World Health Organization, American College of Surgeons, AANA, ANA, ASA, to name a few, and other organizations who have become experts in the field of emerging pathogens, such as Nebraska Medicine. We've developed a tool for managing a patient with COVID-19 in the OR. Tonight, we will be discussing this guidance and how it can be used in multiple operating room settings who may have different air handling systems, different floor plans, and different pathways moving patients through a facility. Keep in mind, this is a tool that may need to be revised to meet your situation and needs, and guidance may change as we learn more about the virus and how it's transmitted. In deciding to use this guidance, it is important to work with your surgeons, anesthesia providers, infection preventionists, and nursing personnel in making joint decisions in the care of the COVID-19 surgical patient. There are several decisions that will need to be made before a COVID-19 patient is brought to the operating room. A recommendation was made on March 18th this year by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid to limit all non-essential planned surgeries and procedures, which were defined as emergent and urgent surgeries, which they defined then as emergent and urgent surgeries meant to save a life, preserve organ function, or avoid further harm due to underlying disease or condition. The CMS document also states that the urgency of a surgery must be evaluated on an individual basis with consideration of the patient's medical risks if surgery were to be delayed, the level of community transmission, your supply of PPE, facility testing capabilities, and then the resources, beds, staff, equipment, and supplies. This recommendation led the American College of Surgeons, the American Society of Anesthesiologists, and AORN to release a joint statement on March 24th calling for the creation of a surgical review committee composed of representatives from surgery, anesthesia, infection prevention, and nursing leadership that would meet on a daily basis to conduct surgical triage decisions. The process of managing COVID-19 patients in the operating room will be based on real-time resources in your facility and the burden of disease in your community, and a risk assessment helps determine the plan of care. Responsibilities of the Surgical Review Committee will be to identify patient status before performing an urgent or emergent procedure. And many of you may perform testing on patients before surgery to determine their infection status, and then the Surgical Committee will then use that information in whether to schedule those procedures. Another determination that we'll need to make is if the procedure can be safely delayed until the patient is no longer infectious, or determine if the procedure could safely be carried out in the patient room or done at the bedside. If neither of these is an option, if possible, use a dedicated OR for COVID-19 patients, separated as much as possible from operating rooms used for the non-COVID-19 patients, and use either an airborne infection isolation room, that's a negative pressure room, or a positive pressure room as determined by the interdisciplinary team and the risk to the patient and perioperative personnel. So preparation of the operating room. If it's decided that the patient will undergo surgery in the OR, there are several actions that need to occur before the patient arrives. The minimum number of people should be assigned to the room, and that would be the anesthesia provider, RN circulator, scrub person, surgeon, and surgical assistant. Prepare the OR before the patient arrives. Hold a briefing by all members of the surgical team to assure all the supplies, equipment, blood, and other materials are available and working. Remove all unnecessary equipment or supplies from the operating room. A plastic cover may be used to protect equipment that is in the room, provided the cover does not interfere with its function. place contact and airborne precaution signs on all entrances to the OR, provide PPE outside the OR, or if it's available, use an anteroom for donning or doffing. Determine what PPE will be worn by personnel in the operating room based on the resources that you have available and the risk assessment performed by the interdisciplinary team. Assign a runner or extra circulator who will remain outside the operating room to retrieve supplies that are not in the room. Because the runner will not be entering the OR, they can wear a surgical mask. Supplies will be delivered to the anteroom by the runner for pickup by the in-room circulator. If an anteroom is used, the anteroom doors will be kept closed. One door will be open to drop supplies and then closed. The other door will be open to receive supplies and then closed. Both doors should never be open at the same time. So now I want to talk about transport to the operating room. Once the room is prepared, notify the patient care team on the floor or in the intensive care unit of impending transport. Ideally, the patient should be transported to an airborne infection isolation room for intubation or directly to the OR if they are already intubated. The transport team, after performing hand hygiene, dons PPE for airborne and contact precautions before entering the patient's room. This includes a gown, an N95 respirator mask, eye protection, and finally gloves. The transport team transfers the patient to a transport stretcher or transports on the patient bed. A surgical mask should be placed on the patient if they're unintubated and they can tolerate it. Otherwise, have the patient cover his mouth with a facial tissue. Cover the patient then with a clean sheet, and then the team removes and disposes of their contaminated gown, gloves, and again performs hand hygiene. And then dons clean gloves to clean and disinfect high-touch areas on the stretcher or bed, such as the side rails and headboard, and any controls that will be touched by personnel during transport. Then they doff the gloves and perform hand hygiene, open the door, and push the stretcher out of the room into the corridor and close the door to the room. Keep the respirator on during transport. Eye protection may be kept on to conserve supplies. If the transport team anticipates being in contact with the patient, wear a gown and gloves in addition to a respirator mask and eye protection. And if available, an additional transporter will open doors and secure elevator buttons that is not wearing PPE. Now I want to turn this over to Karen to discuss once the patient is in the operating room.
Thank you, Terry. Now that Terry's gotten our patient to the OR, let's talk about some intraoperative precautions. The proper donning and doffing of PPE is vital to preventing transmission of COVID-19. Before entering the OR, team members should perform hand hygiene and don PPE in the following order. First, an isolation gown, making sure to tie any ties in bows to facilitate easy release at the end of the case. Next, a surgical N95 respirator, remembering to apply the bottom strap first at the nape of the neck, and then the upper strap towards the crown of the head. Don't forget to perform a seal check. Next will be eye protection, which can be goggles or a face shield, and then a pair of gloves, making sure there is no skin exposed between the gown and the glove cup. For scrub team members, respiratory protection and eye protection should be donned outside the room, but the sterile gown and 2 pairs of sterile gloves should be donned inside the room after surgical hand antisepsis has been performed. PPE should remain in place and not be readjusted during surgery. At the end of the case, before leaving the OR, remove and dispose of the contaminated isolation gowns and gloves inside the room, perform hand hygiene, and then remove the eye protection, being careful not to touch the front of the face shield or the goggles. The surgical N95 respirator should remain on until you have left the OR and closed the door. The surgical N95 respirator should be removed using only the straps, and again, being careful not to touch the front of the respirator. Discard respirator and perform hand hygiene. Removal of PPE needs to be slow and deliberate. Each facility may need to adapt these steps that we just covered to meet their current PPE supply. Therefore, completing training and practicing of your facility's donning and doffing procedures is critical. You should perform hand hygiene at any point in the doffing process if you think you have contaminated yourself. Some facility procedures have you perform hand hygiene after each step of the doffing process, and this is an acceptable practice. When performing intubation, which is considered an aerosol generating procedure, a minimal number of personnel should be at the head of the bed and should wear properly fitted surgical N95 respirators, which have not been reprocessed, eye protection, gowns, and gloves. An interdisciplinary facility team may determine that powered air purifying respirators, or PAPRs, may be allowed in place of surgical N95 respirators. If this is decided, a standardized procedure should be established that outlines their use and how the sterile field will be protected from contamination. These measures may include covering portions of the sterile field and designated the direction in which the blower will be exhausted. If it is determined that personnel who are not needed for intubation will leave the room and return after enough air exchanges have occurred to remove air contaminants, those individuals may wear a surgical mask if the surgery being performed is not at high risk for generating aerosols, such as oral or upper airway surgery. However, the RN circulator should remain in the room at the patient's bedside for patient safety and should be wearing respiratory protection. Scrub personnel leaving the room should cover their sterile field, then remove the gown and gloves in the room and perform hand hygiene. If the scrub person must leave their sterile gowns and gloves on to conserve supplies, they should minimize their movements and take caution to prevent contaminating themselves. An interdisciplinary team may also determine that a portable high-efficiency particulate air or HEPA filtration unit may be used for intubation by positioning the unit near the patient's breathing zone and obtaining engineering consultation to determine the correct placement and whether that unit should remain on during the entire procedure. Because the risk of transmission of COVID-19 through aerosolized blood and body fluids is unknown, precautions should be taken to prevent transmission. One such precaution is the use of smoke evacuators with filters, and depending on your local situation and patient population, it may also be ideal to have all members of the perioperative team wear respiratory protection. But this decision should take into account not only your N95 supply at present time, but also the projected usage. Consult with your facility management, engineering, infection prevention, anesthesia providers, and surgeons to determine if a negative pressure or positive pressure OR will be utilized based on the capabilities of your particular air handling system. The interdisciplinary team may also determine that a portable ante-room system HEPA combination unit may be used. Regardless of the type of airflow used, if the patient is intubated in the OR, allow sufficient air exchanges to remove air contaminants before personnel who are not wearing an N95 or PAPR re-enter the room after intubation. This time for this to occur would depend on a number of air exchanges. For a room with 15 to 20 air exchanges, it will be around 28 minutes. Consult with your facilities management team to determine the specific time for your facility. Next, perform skin antisepsis according to your facility's policy and procedure. Use a smoke evacuation system to evacuate all surgical smoke. Call the runner to retrieve supplies or items needed during the procedure. Remember to limit the number of door openings as well as how wide that door is being opened. If an ante-room is used, only one door should be opened at a time. If retrieving items from a cabinet in the OR, remove your gloves and perform hand hygiene before retrieving them. Remove gross soil from instruments at the sterile field and keep instruments moist until the patient leaves the room. If the patient is waking up and about to be extubated before the instruments have been pre-treated and removed from the room, personnel who are not wearing respiratory protection while serving the function of breaking down the field should leave the room during extubation. It is critically important for the team in the room to be safe and protected as the highest priority. Next, when handling specimens, you want to place specimens in the container, wipe the outside of the container with the disinfectant, and then add the patient label, and then place the container inside another container. Place any required paperwork inside the outer container, then follow facility guidance for labeling the outer container. Inform the laboratory or pathology department of anticipated specimen arrival, then pass the contained specimen to the healthcare provider that's outside the room, or doff your PPE and exit the room with the specimen. When making a direct specimen handover, inform the individual that's receiving the specimen of the known or suspected COVID-19 status of the patient. Extubate the patient in an airborne infection isolation room if available. If the patient is to be extubated in the OR, all personnel not needed for extubation will leave the room. Keep the door closed and wait to transport the patient after extubation until a complete air exchange has occurred.
There are many different scenarios that can occur after the procedure has been completed and the patient is ready for transport. Some patients will be taken directly to ICU intubated. Others may be extubated and recovered in the operating room and then transferred directly to a patient room. Others may be taken to a negative pressure room for extubation. If the patient is recovered and extubated in the OR, transfer the patient directly to the ICU or patient room. If the patient remains intubated, transfer the patient directly to the ICU. Call the patient care team on the floor or in the ICU to notify them of impending transfer. Again, place a surgical mask on an unintubated patient if it can be tolerated, or have the patient cover his or her mouth with a facial tissue. Transfer the patient to a transport stretcher or the patient bed, and then cover the patient with a clean sheet. Remove and dispose of the contaminated gowns and gloves and perform hand hygiene. Keep the respirator on during transport and keep eye protection on to conserve supplies. Don clean gloves to clean and disinfect high-touch areas on the stretcher or bed, the rails and the headboard, and any controls that will be touched by personnel during transport. Then remove gloves and perform hand hygiene. Assign an additional transporter who is not wearing PPE to open doors and secure elevator buttons. If it is anticipated that the transport team will come in contact with the patient, wear a gown and gloves in addition to eye protection and a respirator.
Now let's talk about what to do after the patient leaves the OR. After the patient has left the OR, place pre-treated instruments in a closed cart and wipe the outside of the cart with a hospital-approved disinfectant before transferring the cart to the decontamination area. For open carts, place a clean cover over the cart before transferring it to the decontamination area. Instruments and devices that have been used in procedures for patients with known or suspected COVID-19 should be handled using existing protocols and standard procedures. All processing steps should follow manufacturer's instructions for use and be consistent with AORN guidelines for cleaning and care of surgical instruments, sterilization packaging systems, and sterilization. PPE for decontamination personnel should include a fluid-resistant gown with sleeves, a mask with a fluid barrier, an eye shield or face shield, gloves that extend beyond the cuff of the gown, and shoe covers or booties that are designed for use as PPE. As is done when cleaning all instruments, brushing, flushing, and other manual cleaning steps should be performed underwater to avoid aerosolization. This is especially important now because brushing above the waterline can produce aerosols, and the risk of these in the context of COVID-19 is not known. The current CDC guidance states that routine cleaning and disinfection procedures using an Environmental Protection Agency registered hospital-grade disinfectant from List N is appropriate for SARS-CoV-2, the virus causing COVID-19 in healthcare settings. After the patient leaves the room, entry into the room for cleaning should be delayed until sufficient time has elapsed for enough air exchanges to remove aerosolized infectious particles. As mentioned earlier, your facility management team can provide the time frame that is needed. When sufficient time has elapsed, individuals performing cleaning should perform hand hygiene and don a gown and gloves. A face mask and eye protection should also be worn if splash or spray is anticipated during cleaning, or if these items are in the disinfectant instructions for use. Shoe covers are not necessary as part of the PPE. As is routinely done in all OR cleaning, the door should remain closed and not be propped open, and the cleaning cart should remain in the hallway. Cleaning should concentrate on those horizontal and high-touch surfaces following the enhanced cleaning procedure as outlined in the AORN Environmental Cleaning Guideline, which is available on our COVID-19 clinical support page. Any plastic covering that was placed on equipment should be discarded or cleaned with the List N EPA-registered disinfectant. It is important that any equipment leaving the room be thoroughly cleaned before removal. Sterile package supplies that have not been used and are not in a cabinet or in a closed cart should be discarded, as packaging may become contaminated during aerosolizing producing procedures. According to the most recent information from the Centers for Disease Control, management of medical waste can be performed in accordance with routine procedures as outlined in your state and federal regulations. This directive also includes laundry. There is no evidence that novel coronavirus needs additional treatment.
Thank you, Terry and Karen. Now we'll hear from Erin, who'll give us an update on the decontamination of N95s.
Thank you, Lisa, and good evening, and thank you everyone for joining us. For the next few minutes, I will be reviewing information about N95 decontamination and some updates to emergency use authorizations issued by the FDA. I want to open with this message that while caring for surgical patients, it is critically important for the team in the room to be safe and protected as the highest priority. Use of decontaminated N95 respirators carries risk, and it is important that you understand these risks. The first question that I'm going to review tonight is around any updates to emergency use authorizations issued by the FDA. So the question is, you talked about N95 decontamination on April 2nd and discussed FDA emergency use authorizations. Are there any new emergency use authorizations issued since then? The short answer to this is yes. But first, I want to review some context. It is important to understand the distinction between FDA clearance and authorization. There are multiple ways that devices and processes may become available to you for PPE reprocessing. Remember that these are different, and anything that falls outside of the usual FDA clearance process should be carefully evaluated for risk before implementation. The usual FDA clearance process requires the device manufacturer to complete extensive validation studies, which can take months or even years, and is usually conducted by an independent laboratory. Using devices and processes that have undergone the FDA clearance process provides you some assurance that the risks and benefits have been considered, studied, and determined to be safe before the device or process hits the market. When the FDA clearance is issued for a medical device, it includes the approved uses or indications for that device. There are no N95 cleared decontamination methods. All of these fall under emergency use authorization. In times of emergency, the FDA has a process to approve additional uses for a product, a drug, or device outside of its initially cleared use, and even to approve uses of previously unapproved and uncleared products, drugs, and devices. In this case, the company submits an application for the emergency use authorization and must answer some specific questions about how their product or service helps during the emergency. You'll see at the bottom of this slide the title of an FDA guidance document where you can find details for this information. Pages 14 through 16 will take you to the information about emergency use authorization. On April 2nd, the only emergency use authorization that had been issued for decontamination of N95 was for a vaporized hydrogen peroxide unit from Battelle, and that system is not widely available across the country. Since the April 2nd virtual clinical update from AORN, 3 new emergency use authorizations have been issued for N95 decontamination, and you can see those on the screen, along with the dates that the emergency use authorization was issued. So Steris with VPRO, ASP Sterad, and Stryker Sterizone. It's important to understand both how to access the information about emergency use authorizations on the FDA website and how to use this information. In the following slides, I'll walk you through how to locate this information on the FDA Emergency Use Authorization website. This is what the FDA Emergency Use Authorization page looks like. The link here will take you to this page. This information is also posted on the COVID-19 OR NurseLink discussion threads and in the AORN COVID-19 frequently asked questions on the support page. On the FDA Emergency Use Authorization page, you will find updated information about emergency use authorizations for personal protective equipment, as you see here, in vitro diagnostics, including test kits, ventilators, and other medical devices. Today, we are focusing on the personal protective equipment section, as you see on the screen circled in red. You will find listed in this section all emergency use authorizations, circled in purple as you see here, that are in effect during this declared emergency. Now I want to direct your attention to the links circled in teal. Before instituting an N95 respirator decontamination method in your facility, it is essential that you review and understand the information contained in all of these, including, first, a fact sheet for healthcare personnel that informs you of the significant known and potential risks and benefits of the emergency use of decontaminated N95 respirators. Secondly, instructions for healthcare facilities that includes material compatibility and detailed instructions for how to use the device for N95 decontamination. And finally, instructions for healthcare personnel that includes information for the user about participating in the decontamination process. It is essential that you and your team study these documents as a first step in setting up a decontamination method in your facility. As a reminder, decontamination of N95 respirators is a crisis capacity strategy and should only be used if there are no new N95s available. If your organization has new N95s available, these should be used first. In other words, don't do this unless you run out of N95s. For more information about this, see the CDC website, COVID-19 Strategies for Optimizing the Supply of PPE, and the AORN FAQ entitled, "We Have a Shortage of Surgical Masks and/or Respiratory Protection, What Should We Do?" on the COVID-19 support page. AORN continues to collaborate with FDA regarding availability and decontamination of N95s, and we'd appreciate it if you would take a minute to answer this poll. You can help us understand your current practice and situation. So now we'll move on to some additional questions. I saw on the CDC website that decontaminated N95s should not be worn by healthcare workers who are present for aerosol generating procedures. Can you tell me more about that? Yes, that is correct. Personnel who are present for aerosol generating procedures should only wear N95 or equivalent FDA cleared and NIOSH approved respirators that have not been decontaminated. The CDC statement supporting this is, given the uncertainties of the impact of decontamination on respirator performance, these decontaminated filtering facepiece respirators should not be worn by healthcare personnel when performing or present for an aerosol generating procedure. Next question. I'm confused about how to determine if my respirator is FDA cleared and NIOSH approved. What do these things mean? Information about NIOSH approval can be found on the product label, either on the respirator or its packaging. N95 respirators are Class 2 medical devices that require FDA clearance for use. FDA clearance entails strict adherence to validation studies to gain this clearance. This is to ensure that users are protected at a level that the FDA has determined to be safe and effective. As we mentioned previously, there is a difference between a normal FDA clearance and FDA emergency use authorization, with FDA clearance having a greater degree of study and validation. There are some respirators, for example, from international sources, that have been granted FDA emergency use authorization in the US during this health crisis. NIOSH approved means that a respirator has been studied and provides respiratory protection, and this could be for a wide range of applications that includes industrial settings or medical settings. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, specifies minimum approval requirements for respiratory protection devices in Title 42, the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 84. NIOSH reviews respirator approval applications which contain technical specifications, drawings, and other related information. NIOSH also inspects, examines, and tests these respirators to determine that the applicable requirements are met. Respirators that are designed, labeled, and marketed for use in industrial settings, think the ones that you can buy in a home improvement store, are NIOSH approved if they are labeled as such, but not FDA cleared because they are not designed, labeled, and tested as medical devices. Next question, what is the difference between an N95 and a surgical N95? The short answer to this question is fluid barrier protection. Surgical N95s are designed, tested, and labeled for use in surgical settings where splash and splatter is anticipated, and these are required to have a higher level of validated fluid barrier than a non-surgical N95. In other words, surgical N95s meet the requirements to be both an N95 respirator and a surgical mask. It is important to understand that if you are wearing an N95 that is not a surgical N95 in a setting where splash and splatter is anticipated, like an operating room, it is in this case you would need a full face shield to provide fluid barrier protection in addition to that non-surgical N95. Now we'll go through some questions about what is a better choice. What is a better choice? An FDA cleared NIOSH approved respirator that has been decontaminated, or a new NIOSH approved respirator that is not FDA cleared? This is a tricky question and requires some critical thought. If you have both, and you're going to use the respirator in an environment where an aerosol generating procedure will be performed, like intubation, the new NIOSH approved respirator with a full face shield is the better option. And I'll give you a few reasons why this is so. First, the CDC recommends that decontaminated N95s not be used in situations where there is an aerosol generating procedure. And the new NIOSH approved respirator provides a validated particulate filtration, but no fluid barrier. So the full face shield can provide that missing fluid barrier protection. And together, the new NIOSH approved respirator plus face shield is the more reliable option for protection for you in this situation. Next, what is a better choice? An N95 respirator with an exhalation valve or one without? So respirators with exhalation valves can be used in a healthcare setting when it is not important to maintain a sterile field. An example of an acceptable practice would be when taking the temperature or blood pressure of a patient, certainly not the operating room. Respirators with exhalation valves should not be used in the presence of a sterile field because the exhalation valve allows unfiltered air to escape and potentially contaminate the sterile field. Now, what is a better choice? A new surgical mask or a decontaminated N95 respirator for surgery? Your first choice should always be a new surgical N95 or equivalent respirator. If neither of these are available, you should choose the option that provides the best filtration efficiency to provide you respiratory protection. In this case, unfortunately, it is unclear which of these two options is better. This is a decision that should be made after an interdisciplinary risk assessment. The CDC recommends, again, given the uncertainties on the impact of decontamination on respirator performance, they should not be worn by healthcare providers when performing or present for aerosol generating procedures. So actually, neither of these are suitable protection in the presence of an aerosol generating procedure. All right, what is better? An N95 respirator that has been contaminated with UV or one that has been contaminated with Sterad, Vpro, or Sterizone? This is another tricky one, and it depends on which type of respirator you are using and what the materials are. For example, if your organization uses cellulose-containing respirators, then you would not want to use Sterad, Vpro, or Sterizone because the hydrogen peroxide used in these systems is damaging to the materials and may render them ineffective. However, and on the other hand, UV decontamination has not received FDA emergency use authorization, so instructions and use of the UV decontamination has not been authorized for use by the FDA. These are tricky questions. All right, now, what is a better choice? A decontaminated N95 plus orthopedic hood or a PAPR? This one is clear, the PAPR. Decontaminated N95 is not suitable respiratory protection during aerosol generating procedures, and an orthopedic hood does not provide respiratory protection. A PAPR is going to give you the best respiratory protection. Just make sure that you are taking precautions to prevent contamination of the sterile field. Another question, can we use a P100 mask in the operating room? The answer to this is yes, provided that they do not have an exhalation valve. A P100 respirator is a NIOSH approved but not FDA cleared or authorized. That means that well, it's not FDA cleared. These have been authorized. And you can find that information on the FDA website under emergency use authorization for respirators that are designed and intended for industrial settings that can be used during this pandemic. So this means that they provide respiratory protection, but are not validated to provide protection from splash and splatter. In this case, a full face shield should be worn with it in the operating room. So for more information about NIOSH approved respirators, I'd like to invite you to visit the link on your screen to detailed information about NIOSH approved respirators, including lists of those that do have NIOSH approval. And another question, how can we get more information about the studies that support N95 decontamination? So there are some really great resources out there. First of all, definitely visit the CDC website that discusses N95 decontamination. Also, reach out to the manufacturer of the specific N95 respirators that you use to ask them about any studies that they are aware of, have done, or support. That's also a good opportunity for you to learn what materials those N95 respirators are made from. And also, there is a resource at n95decon.org. N95Decon is a volunteer collective of scientists, engineers, clinicians, and students from universities across the United States, including the University of California, San Francisco, University of California, Berkeley, the University of Chicago, Harvard University, Stanford University, Georgetown University, Seattle University, the University of Utah, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the University of Michigan. It includes other professionals as well from the private sector. So N95Decon seeks to review, collate, publish, and disseminate scientific information about N95 decontamination to help in decisions about N95 decontamination and reuse. Another goal of N95Decon is to identify important missing information and then plan and carry out future joint research projects to address those knowledge gaps and rapidly without unnecessary duplication of effort. N95Decon is not sponsored by any group, nor does it represent the interest of any private or public organization or specific technology. It is important to understand, though, that information provided by N95Decon is not necessarily FDA authorized, and it is important to understand the status of FDA authorization prior to using any decontamination method. And again, you can find that information on the FDA Emergency Use Authorization website. The manufacturer of your specific N95 can provide you information about what is known and unknown about using various decontamination methods for their products. Stay tuned about an upcoming webinar that will be presented by AORN Amy Isham that will feature some of the scientists behind N95decon.org. I just want to close with this reminder. Decontamination of N95 respirators is a crisis capacity strategy and should only be used if there are no new N95s available.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank our members for your participation tonight and our panel for their expertise and guidance. AORN will continue to monitor the pandemic progress and update our website every day with new and relevant support materials. Our clinical consult line is open Monday through Thursday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Mountain Time. If you have questions, please call us, especially if you don't find your question answered on our FAQs page. I also encourage you to join in the OR Nursing discussions because we are always able to learn from each other there as we get through this crisis. Sadly, we are out of time. Thank you again, take care, and have a good evening.